Hey all, here OS Reviews. You're watching our throwback review of the Sony Xperia Z, the first generation in 2018. So this was a smartphone released by Sony back in 2013. We have a refurbished unit here. Let's peel off the screen protector. There are a few reasons why you may want to consider this handset. For one, again, the price is really inexpensive now. You can find it on Amazon or eBay for around 80 bucks if you look around. And secondly, again, Sony hasn't really changed their design on their phones after the Xperia Z debut, which got a little repetitive, but on the plus side, it means that the first generation phone still has a very current look, if you think about it, because it's only in 2018 that Sony started to migrate towards a taller aspect ratio and starting to play around with a bit more with the form of their phones. But still, that means this phone still looks, in terms of hardware design, very current all these years later. In terms of specifications, it has a Snapdragon S4 Pro processor, which is quad-core. It also comes with 2 GB of built-in RAM. We have a 5-inch Full HD display along with a 13-megapixel camera on the very back. And the phone is certified to be waterproof and dustproof, so all the ports are actually covered up on this device. It features a dual glass design, so glass on the rear and on the front, and in terms of connectivity, it is fully stacked because it was once a flagship level phone, including NFC, Wi-Fi, GPS, Bluetooth, but it does not come with wireless charging. The 5-inch display, which is an IPS LCD panel and uses Sony's Bravia engine, borrowed from their TVs, and it looks, again, very impressive. It was one of the highest pixel densities when it first came out, and all these years later it still holds up pretty well because, again, a full 1080p screen is still quite common on today's mid-end and even on a few more premium phones as well. We have a earpiece on the top and a front-facing camera, which is about 3 megapixels, and on the very top we also have, again, ports which cover up the 3.5mm headphone jack. It is a very reflective phone because all these panels are made out of this chrome-like material. There is a microSD card slot on the side to expand on the built-in memory, and on the right there is a volume rocker and a power switch that's very ergonomic and round like most Sony phones. So taking a look at the UI here, it is running on Sony's Xperia UI on top of Android. It originally debuted with Android 4.1, which is, again, very outdated now, but the phone has received updates to 5.1 Lollipop by Sony over the air. Again, the screen here does seem quite sharp. With that being said, it's not quite as vibrant or punchy as perhaps newer Super LCD screens on the market, and the viewing angles aren't quite as impressive either as on some newer displays. So taking a closer look at the UI now, it is a pretty heavy scan on top of Android, not stock at all, but very common for Sony phones back in 2013 and 2014, and quite nostalgic to take a look back at. It's very colorful with many of the themes that were inspired from Sony's PlayStation devices. We have a Walkman app as well as different apps designed by Sony for the album, movies, and their own catalog of applications, and there are quite a few applications on here. The Xperia Z also came on contract with many carriers around the world, in the US with T-Mobile, for instance, so you see quite a few bloatware installed out of the box, along with the regular array of Google apps such as Gmail, the Play Store, YouTube, Chrome, and so on and so forth. There is an app tray on the bottom along with virtual controls for going back home, opening up the multitasking, as well as being able to access smaller apps which open as a window on top of the display. So for instance, if I wanted to access the calculator, it would open up as a small little widget, very similar to on a computer or a desktop. So of course, Sony is also known for making excellent photography-centric phones, and they produce many of the sensors found on other flagships. Now, the interesting thing here is the boot up sequence on the original Xperia Z still has the same sound from a CyberShot camera or a regular point and shoot if you've ever used a digital camera from Sony before. That's quite nostalgic. With that being said, the biggest difference looking back at this camera now is probably the shutter speed. Loading it up and firing up takes about 2 seconds to open, as you see there. And there's definitely more lag compared to a modern phone where you can just double click on the power key to instantly launch into it. The interface is very simple. We can tap to focus and then snap a shot. Now the field of focus is pretty narrow compared to modern phones. It seems like it's very zoomed in to the shot compared to modern cameras that have a much wider field of view. And we can also tap on this button here to select a number of modes, which were advanced for the time, including manual mode to fine adjust things like ISO, a panoramic mode, picture effect to create various filters. And so overall, the number of things that you can adjust on this phone are quite wide for something from 2013. With that being said, it does not have HDR built on in. Overall, the camera performs better than expected for something from 5 years ago. You can tell that even on these posters, which were captured in a slightly darkened room, so in slightly lower light environments, it still does a decent job. Of course, as it gets even darker, a lot of artifacting becomes more apparent. It's just things like exposure. It has a bit more problems when there are areas that are brighter and areas which are darker. You can only seem to tap on one area since there isn't an HDR to compensate. Well, with that being said, again, you do get a surprisingly good amount of detail and accurate looking colors from such an old sensor. Now a test of video playback, such as on YouTube, which is loading this through Chrome directly.
This video will take a closer look in 2017. So again, we're going to go through some of the default programs that you get installed on here, which include Asphalt 6, there's Bruce Lee Dragon Warrior, Crash Bandicoot.
Takeaway is that the speaker quality is actually better than I expected, considering it's a mono unit. It is mounted on the side though, which is a pretty unconventional placement, as opposed to on the bottom, or worse yet, on the rear. And it also gets louder than expected with a bit more depth as well. It doesn't distort too much. You can always use your own headphones, again one of the plus of having a slightly older phone, or you can use stereo Bluetooth if you want to use a wireless speaker, for instance. Playback is also alright in terms of a loading speeds. There's a slight more hesitation than on a more modern chipset, such as a Snapdragon 625, for instance. You have to be slightly more patient, but it's also not too bad. The keyboard the phone uses is also proprietary and designed by Sony. Let's try loading up something like CNET, for instance, and it offers haptic vibration, so it will kind of vibrate whenever you tap on a key to simulate the experience of a physical button. And overall, it's surprisingly easy to type on, considering that this is a 5-inch phone. Taking a look at the loading speeds, again, actually quite respectable as well. Reception quality seems fair. Right now we're connected using Wi-Fi, as you can see here, with about 3 bars. Now, one of the weaknesses of this phone is definitely going to be the 2 gigs of RAM, which, although was quite advanced for a device from 2013, in fact, many flagships from 2015 still had only 2 gigs of RAM. With that being said, you definitely have to be more careful when it comes to opening up too many tabs, especially on complex sites like the New York Times. If you have more than, let's say, 5 tabs open, it will definitely slow down very considerably, and you get a lot more jumpiness in terms of animations. We also have access to the Walkman, again, player, so Sony does have also history in making excellent audio devices, and although this phone does not have a built-in DAC like the newer HTC 10, it still packs, again, pretty nice software that includes many visualizations and EQ adjustments to fine-tune your music experience. Again, all the apps here are basically designed by Sony, so they are all non-standard in terms of not just using the regular Android app. So we have a custom kind of alarm clock app here for things like timer and stopwatch. The UI looks alright. There's a little bit of hesitation here as we're scrolling along. When it comes to support of applications, you can still install any title that you would find in the Play Store without any issues. It's just you have to wait for significantly longer for titles to load, and the graphics performance is nowhere near modern chipsets. So if you are trying to play really heavy games like Asphalt 9, for instance, it will most likely crash and fail. But for other titles which are less graphically intensive, for more 2D based games, things like maybe Angry Birds, it still loads and runs without any issues at all. And again, the majority of productivity tools, things like Office editing, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, can also be performed without any issues either. In terms of widgets, again, we can scroll through our images here in this carousel view on this main panel. A lot of kind of custom work from Sony here from back in the day. I can also long hold to take a look at some of their other widgets, which are again designed by them, different from stock Android as well as themes which you can apply to change the color, for instance, of the interface from Sony. There's also wallpapers which you can take a look at, including many which are again designed by Sony to match the entire experience of the phone, which made it feel quite sleek and advanced back in the day. So that's more or less it as far as a revisited review of the original Sony Xperia Z here in 2018. Is this a phone I would still recommend picking up? I would say it's kind of tough to, especially because performance is already starting to hang. This is a device that will definitely not receive any software updates going forward, and although it's running on Android 5.0 right now, which is still alright, again, looking towards the future, it's only going to be more outdated. With that being said, if you're getting this at a really low price, maybe around 50 bucks or so, there may be still a reason to consider it because compared to newer phones coming out, it definitely has a more striking design and it has a better display than many are expecting as well. Full HD panel, which still holds up relatively well, and a camera that is, again, surprisingly still quite decent. But of course, other elements in terms of speed and performance are not going to be quite as impressive. But if you are comparing it with maybe a Snapdragon 200 or 400 series or a low low-end MediaTek chipset that has only quad-core, then yes, perhaps this still has a slight edge over in terms of technical performance. So again, in those cases, if you're getting it really cheap, or if you're a Sony fan and you are looking to collect more of their devices, then perhaps now would be an opportunity to take a closer look at this phone. But for the majority of consumers that want more performance out of their devices, there are, of course, much better options available now for not that much money either. So you can learn more details about the Sony Xperia original as well as other Sony Xperia Z phones in the line in the description box below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been our throwback look at the original Sony Xperia Z in 2018.